our president, Dr. John R. Emmons, who will extend the welcome to the university. President Emmons.
Thank you. In the first place, I want you to know that what you've just seen is an example of how friendly and how helpful we try to be on our university campus. It's always a pleasure to welcome a group to the university. I have a pattern I try to use when I do it. I try to say you're welcome and tell you, then I brag a little about the university, and then I try to express one idea. I think the university president is supposed to have an idea once in a while. Let me say that we really consider ourselves most fortunate to have this conference annually, and this is the 13th conference we've had. And I think Nyla Kirkpatrick Cavalt's letter that she's written to her friends is one that you should read, because it expresses her feeling about this conference and the contribution she has made better than any of the rest of us can say it for her. But let me also say to you that the university finds itself very happy because we are the recipient of a gift from Nyla. Over this period of years, it makes it possible for us to do this kind of thing. Interestingly enough, and this is what I want to visit with you about the university, your university, Ball State University. The tradition of our institution has to do with the same kind of thing that Nyla Cavalt is carrying on here. Beneficence, which is the statue that you see on the campus, which was placed there by the community members to honor the members of the Ball family who started this institution. So this is a tradition at Ball State, that people help to do the kinds of things that make it possible for us to have what we say a margin of difference or a margin of excellence that makes Ball State University what it is. I could go on with the gifts of the Ball brothers. The place that we're sitting now, this building, a part of this building, when we indicated back in the late 1940s that we wanted to build a student center, we had a group of citizens, 7 men, who came out to my office and sat down and said, "Now, when you get ready to build this building, we want to help." And I said, "Well, we can build this building out of student fees and on a bond issue basis. We still want to help." So they raised about $140,000 to help us build this particular unit of the student center. Now, this continuation of the kind of way people feel about us is what happened when the community raised $1.5 million to build a college and community auditorium. Now, I think all of these things mean something not only to the young people in our community. People think these things are built just for students, but all of us who think about it know that they really are built for the total area, the citizens, young and not so young, who live in our total area, and this is a real contribution. I think I ought to tell you something about the rest of the buildings on campus so that you understand when you meet people in the community, you talk about, as some of them do, the terrific number of tax dollars that go into building buildings on the Ball State University campus. For instance, right now we're building $23 million worth of construction on this campus. But less than $2 million of it came out of state tax dollars. The rest of it is all being paid for by students. For instance, you see the big building going up on the corner of McKinley and Riverside. That's a teacher's college building. It's a classroom building. But the last session of the legislature and this session of the legislature also didn't give us money for classroom buildings anymore. And they don't build auditoriums, they don't build stadiums, they don't build residence halls, they don't build health service buildings. We have now, with the exception of $1,400,000 plus $900,000 there, out of $32 million that we are going to be building in the next 2 years, starting or building. There are only $2 1/4 million that are tax dollars from the state tax treasury. The rest of it has to be generated out of student fees or room and board fees. So when you come to the campus and see these, don't think about us anymore as a state-supported institution. Think about us as a state-assisted institution. Now, the idea that I'd like to express. I think as you visit the campus, all across the campus, and see, if you have an opportunity to see these buildings going up, we want you to understand that they are for the use of the people in general in our community. We have grown, as you know, from when I came in 1945, where we had 1,009 students. 10 years later, we had 9,001 students, and now we have 13,000 students. The next fall, there'll be 14,000 students on campus. We're not talking about any people taking correspondence or any of our extension people. These are the people who actually come to the campus for their collegiate instruction. And by the way, what I said about campus buildings being built by students rather than tax dollars is true of all 4 of our state institutions in the state of Indiana. And as you probably know, on the private church-related independent colleges, a goodly percentage of their buildings, too, have to be built out of some of the student fees and some from gifts, just the same as we are. It's appropriate to have meetings in which we talk about the problems of those who are not so young. And it's great to see a group of people get together. The ideas that are expressed today on what kind of a world is it for people who are older is a very appropriate kind of discussion to have in 1967. Local communities are interested in it. The state is interested in the project. The federal government is interested in it. But in addition to all of these that are, if you want to say, governmental in nature, each one of us as a person, young or old, is interested in what happens to us individually and what kind of world we live in and what kind we make for ourselves. Because the world in which one lives is not created entirely by someone outside. The greater percentage of it is created by what happens inside a person and the kind of interpersonal relationships one builds with other people as well as with other things. And the environment is only an extraneous part of it. And we react to it in many, many ways. We hope that the conference today, the presentations from speakers, the opportunity for discussion, and the opportunity just to be together will be fruitful for each one of you. Thanks for coming, and thanks for letting me talk to you a moment.
Thank you, President Emmons. Our theme this year, as President Emmons implied, is reality is, as I see it, the real world of the older person. And our keynote speaker for today has certainly fitted in well to this theme. Dr. Arthur Rossner was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. He did his undergraduate work, however, at Valparaiso University. I guess I can mention that. I think it'll be all right. Since the President said that private institutions are also of importance here in Indiana. He obtained his Bachelor of Arts degree in 1954. For the next 5 years, he was a pilot in the United States Air Force, being stationed for 2 of those years in Japan. For a short time preceding his graduate training, he was pilot with commercial airlines. His graduate work was done at the University of Chicago, where he studied with the Committee on Human Development, receiving special training in clinical psychology and social gerontology. His master's degree, awarded in 1964, was based on a study of retirement and life satisfactions of airline pilots, and that must have been early retirement on your part. The PhD degree, which he's completed all of his requirements, will ultimately be, the finalized part of it will be in June of this year. He has presented papers at the annual meeting of the American Psychological Association in 1965 and the 7th International Congress on Gerontology in Vienna, Austria in June 1966. There he spoke on part of his doctoral thesis entitled Stress and the Maintenance of Self-Concept in the Aged. He's a member of both the Gerontological Society and the American Psychological Association. He is currently director of the geriatric program at the Madden Zone Center in Chicago, which is a part of the Illinois Department of Mental Health. His title this morning is, let's see, if I remember correctly, The Real World of the Older Person. It's with a great deal of pleasure that I present to you at this time Dr. Arthur Rossner.
Thank you, Dr. Craddock. It's a great pleasure for me to be here this morning, and indeed a challenge to address a group such as you, in which I see there are many, many older people in our audience. When Dr. Craddock first called me to ask me to give this address, he told me that the theme of the conference would be the real world of the older person. My first thought was, my God, how can anybody define the real world of the older person in 35 or 40 minutes and do a good job of it? And it's taken me a good number of years just to get a feel for what the world of the older person is, and not even that to understand what the real world of the older person is. If you can't hear me, please raise your hand. I'll speak louder.
Can't hear. A little louder.
Okay. The real world of the older person is a very complex world to define and would be viewed differently by social and physical scientists, medical and nursing practitioners, welfare planners, community organizers, and even those who are concerned with the advertising media and consumer spending. Indeed, research has shown that the world of the older person is described differently depending on the age of the observer, with older people probably viewing the world in terms which are very, very difficult for anyone else to grasp. The theme at hand is even more difficult to define because gerontology is a young discipline on which there is as yet insufficient knowledge on which to base theories of development in the second half of the lifespan. We rely, moreover, on imperfect tools and techniques with which to gather research data on older people, and through subjective and biased eyes attempt to interpret what we think this data is telling us. This does not mean, of course, that we halt our efforts to develop new theories or to refine the techniques we use within the field. This morning, I would like you to look with me at the worlds of the older person from one relatively new approach, that of a clinical gerontologist. My purpose is to develop with you two basic themes. The first one is that new and emergent patterns of psychological development occur throughout the second half of the lifespan, and second, that these intrinsic psychological changes may serve to facilitate the process of adaptation and coping with the stress or losses accompanying old age. Before continuing, I would like to address myself to a few of the complexities involved in an attempt to gain perspective on the world of the aging person. I will make reference to recent research in gerontology toward that perspective. If we were to ask a randomly selected group of older persons to describe their world as they see it and live it today, the answers given would reveal very diverse and idiosyncratically defined issues. These responses would be based in large part on such factors as the respondent's age, sex, physical and mental health, degree of involvement with the world around him, his education, his socioeconomic background, his own self-perceived needs, and a host of other variables. It is not now possible to consider all these variables, but it is worthwhile to explore a few to the degree that they will help shed light on what is to follow. One of the ways of getting a grasp on the world of the older person first is to describe what we mean by older person. Arbitrarily, 65 is the point at which a man is described as old today. It is the time at which he is most likely to be forced to retire from an active, work-oriented life to a life of relative passivity and increasing obsolescence. 65 is the age at which a man's Social Security checks begin, and if he is fortunate, the age at which his occupation-connected pension checks begin to arrive. 65 years of age, then, is the time at which a man is forced to reevaluate his concept of himself and relate this concept to a new and unfolding social reality. 65 years of age, however, is not an age at which most men consider themselves old, although they may be defined sociologically and culturally as aged. This difference in opinion between society and the individual highlights an important issue in understanding the world of the older person, and that is the potential conflict between the older person and his society on definition of old. Although we have arbitrarily defined old age as beginning at 65, recent research has shown that there are vast psychological and physiological differences between a group of 65-year-olds and a group of 80-year-olds on such dimensions as personality organization, tasks to be faced in life, and physical vigor. Cross-sectional studies of the lifespan suggest, in addition, that older people are more unlike each other than our younger persons. For example, on the dimensions we typically measure, 20-year-olds are more alike than our 60-year-olds, and 60-year-olds are more like each other than our 80-year-olds. In trying to define the world of the older person, therefore, it is important to realize that old age is not a simple unitary construct. Rather, it is composed of a number of age segments or units, comprising that block of time we call older age. Another perspective toward the question of the world of the older person is to understand the influence of historical or technological changes on the person through his lifespan. To overstate the case, we must consider that people view the world within the context of an overall historical past. A historical past, for example, that an 80-year-old does not necessarily share with a 60-year-old. A history which will be quite different for 35-year-olds today when they grow old and get to be 65 or 85. Mannheim referred to this phenomenon as the non-contemporaneity of contemporaries. By this he meant that although at this moment we all share a common time segment, the younger persons in our midst have not shared with their elders and hence cannot be as influenced by such historically significant events as the depressions of the 1930s. Yet, an event such as this obviously leaves an indelible impression on one who has lived through it, such that it will continue to influence his behavior and attitudes in succeeding years and his view of and feelings about the world in which he lives as an older person. A third and major variable which influences the perspective an older person has on his world are the psychological changes which occur in the process of aging. Research conducted by members of the Committee on Human Development at the University of Chicago suggests that old age is not a static state. Rather, that shifts in personality begin occurring in the 40s, which continue until shortly before death. The shifts that occur appear to antedate any observable changes in behavior. Furthermore, the shifts in personality are seen as occurring in all people and are considered to be part of the normal developmental changes in the second half of the lifespan. That is to say, these shifts are not seen as being pathological and in fact may be very functional and adaptive in maintaining positive mental health in the later years. The process of becoming old, therefore, is seen as a series of active changes in the life of the individual, and not just that period of his life which begins when he reaches 65. An understanding of what some of these changes are will provide another avenue through which we begin to understand what it means to grow old from a psychological point of view. If old age is to be seen in reference to the whole lifespan, we need to look at the process of change. To do so, we must select an arbitrary baseline, usually middle age. One can understand something about old age by studying childhood or youth, but for today's purposes, let us draw inferences about old age by looking at persons in middle age and describing major changes as they occur when these people move into older age. By middle age, I am arbitrarily referring to that period between 40 and 60 years old. When I talk about personality changes or ego changes, I am talking about those processes which are concerned with relating the self to the environment, with selection, regulation, and integration of behavior, with the growth of feelings of competence and mastery, with the control of outcomes in our lives, with the growing awareness of the self as the instrument for achieving one's aims. In very broad and general terms, the ego in childhood is focused upon the development of physical and emotional tools with which to deal with both the inner and outer worlds and with which to carry on its transactions with the environment. In young adulthood, the thrust is toward the outer world and toward active mastery of the environment. Beginning in the 40s, however, the first signs of major redirection of these ego functions from outer to inner concerns occur. For example, in one early investigation, cards from Murray's thematic apperception test were administered to 3 groups of men with mean ages of 30, 40, and 50 who held executive positions in business. Their TAT protocols were analyzed for the dominant themes. The 30-year-old men were described as achievement demanding, confident that they could attain their goals by attending to the demands of the world and relating forcefully and aggressively to an uncomplicated world. Subjects in their 40s, however, saw the world as much more complex and began to re-examine their inner drives, questioning the achievement demands and showing increased self-awareness and preoccupation with emotions. The 50-year-old subjects also saw the outer world as complex and conflictual. Their means of dealing with the environment was by abstract means. They too were preoccupied with thoughts rather than action. With age, therefore, there appeared to be a change from an active, combative outer world orientation to the beginning of an adaptive, conforming inner world orientation. Similar studies showed a shift in the years from 40 to 60 from active mastery to passive mastery, and in very old age to magical mastery of both inner impulses and the outer world. These findings are congruent, by the way, with those of other investigators who describe ego expansion giving way to restriction later in life, in which there is increased introversion accompanied by decreased intellectual efficiency. Also, in middle age, there begins to be a reevaluation of one's perspective of time and new perceptions of time and death. In middle age, the individual begins to admit to open awareness and to accept the fact that time is not infinite and that the self will actually die. There appears to be a shift in which lifetime is measured not from birth, but from death, and in which stock of one's life up to this point is taken. There is a growing conviction in the field of applied gerontology that these changes are intrinsic or developmental in nature and not simply reactive to the stresses of old age, since they appear before the actual losses of aging are seen or felt. In other words, the fact that these personality changes appear in the mid-40s in a group of well-functioning adults seems congruent with the developmental rather than the reactive theory of human personality in the second half of the lifespan. The process of introspection, beginning in the middle years, may be a forerunner of the process of reminiscence seen in old age. It appears that the reminiscence of old age may be a preparatory step in the final restructuring of the ego described by Erik Erikson as ego integrity, or that Robert Butler refers to when he talks about the process of the life review. In this process, the individual reminisces about his life as a way of summing up the totality of who he has been, what he has done, and attempts a psychological reconciliation of whatever conflicts remain. If the reminiscence is successful, the individual may be able to face death with greater equanimity. The restructuring that has occurred is also discussed by Morton Lieberman, who noted that about 6 months prior to death, certain changes become noticeable on some psychological tests, and these changes occur before the social and biological changes occur, which may act as precipitating events. Thus, there is evidence that the ego undergoes a final restructuring in preparation for death. We see then that there are developmental stages evolving throughout the lifespan in which the personality reorganizes itself. Stresses of aging, therefore, may act upon a personality that has new and emergent patterns. We suspect now that these personality changes may serve to facilitate coping behavior in older people in that losses may act on an ego that has been both anticipating and preparing for the age-related stress. I do not mean to minimize the deficits that occur with old age. Obviously, many losses do occur. We are often more impressed, however, how adequately many older people function in the community in spite of what appears to be serious and incapacitating losses. We know, for example, that in very old age, people have a great deal of central nervous system deficit, and that the loss of neurons beginning at age 30 accelerates very precipitously at 80. Yet, even though people in their 80s and above appear to have a great deal of such loss, this damage does not appear sufficient in itself to cause disorientation or social dysfunctioning. The Kansas City study of older people collected data on some aged who were in their 90s who exhibited signs of senility. The investigators in this study were impressed by the fact that many of these aged people experience cycles of orientation and disorientation, and even with severe cortical loss, were able to maintain a reasonable degree of integration in the community. Findings such as these raises the obvious questions of what factors contribute to maintenance or integration of these older people, and conversely, what factors contribute to psychological breakdown or psychological states requiring hospitalization for the elderly. As yet, we do not have sufficient knowledge to generalize regarding the factor or factors relating to psychological health or psychological deterioration in the aged. From the standpoint of maintaining positive mental health in the later years, I have suggested that as a result of the developmental unfolding of ego changes in the second half of the lifespan, people seem psychologically to prepare themselves for coping with the crises to follow. There is general agreement by most investigators as to what some of these crises are and some of the ways in which older people handle them. One anticipated task to be faced in growing old is to learn to cope with less than optimal physical health. Older people often strongly deny their illnesses and use counterphobic maneuvers in which they attempt to conquer their fear of deterioration by physically vigorous activity that seems beyond their capacity. This behavior appears to be a manifestation of a mechanism which older people who are in the best of psychological health use very effectively to maintain integration when confronted with the threat of physical illness. More important than the amount of physical illness is how the person perceives himself. Research conducted by Ethel Shannis, for example, has found that people above 70 will insist that they are not as sick as other people their age. When you consider that by this age, over half their peers have died, their perceptions seem quite realistic, by the way. A second task to be faced in growing old is that of loss of status. One such loss of status for men, which I have touched on, is that which is imposed by the social reality of retirement. Retirement is a relatively recent social development, but it is not that new any longer that most men did not begin preparing for it financially and emotionally many years before they actually leave the workforce. We now see retirement counseling offices in many business establishments. We see complex pension programs being initiated when a young man begins work in any number of occupations or professions. And we also see retirement communities being developed in which a person can purchase a parcel of land or a house in anticipation of his 65th birthday. Some of my own research, as well as that of others, suggest that the potentially negative effects of retirement may be lessened by adequate knowledge about and realistic preparation for this stage of the lifespan. One study, in fact, suggests that men go through a period of transition in the process of retirement, at the end of which health improves as measured by physician reports and self-evaluations. Given the assurance of economic self-sufficiency and the knowledge that help with physical ailments will be available, the older worker may indeed look forward to retirement. Another task which a person as he ages must anticipate and with which he must cope is the loss of significant people. In spite of the fact that some research suggests an anticipation of and preparation for widowhood in the late 40s in women, the impact of the loss of significant other people cannot be minimized as one grows older. The depressions of the aged often have their roots in protracted mourning, with additional losses precipitating crippling grief reactions. In Great Britain, by the way, there has been initiated not so long ago a widows registry whereby the mental health and physical health people in the community keep track of the local residents who at various stages in their life experience certain stress. At these particular times, which may be anticipated, they send people out. They send mental health workers, social workers, nurses, and others out into these people's homes to provide support for them as they go through some of these crises. I think it's something we could anticipate doing in the United States, and which I will talk about a little later on. Another task which a person as he ages must contemplate is whatever it means to face death. This very personal crisis is our price for being mortal. In my clinical work with older people, however, I am very often surprised with the ease with which many of them talk about dying or of the death of friends. It appeared that many of these people had already, in fact, dealt with the issue of dying a number of times. The task or crisis of facing death, or at least of talking about it then, may indeed be a reflection of our own anxiety concerning death, rather than an issue which evokes or an overwhelming degree of anxiety in older people. For example, this behavior may now be understood as functional psychopathology, which refers to those aspects of defenses which are dysfunctional for the person when he is young, but which facilitate adaptation when he is older. The crises or tasks of later life are also coped with in the characteristic manner each person has evolved in his early life for dealing with stress. The coping for the crisis of aging depends, therefore, to a large extent upon individual character structure, on dominant needs, defenses, and adaptive patterns. For some, growing old may be relatively unstressful because it affords an opportunity to satisfy certain needs, perhaps to relax defenses against such needs. For others, growing old is particularly stressful because it undermines lifelong adaptive patterns. Up to this point, I have been emphasizing the potential for growth and adaptation in the aged, an identification that may facilitate the development of services and programs for the very heterogeneous population of older people with whom we work. In spite of this rosy picture for potential growth and integration in the later years, an increasing number of older people are being referred to psychiatric facilities of one kind or another, and most typically the referral is made to a state mental hospital. Hopefully, we may see some reversal in these figures in years to come, because we are finally coming to realize that with the assurance of support and treatment, a substantial number of aged persons have the potential to be maintained in their homes and in their communities. A growing body of research literature points to the fact that the increase in number of aged referred to state mental institutions may have a great deal to do with the lack of proper utilization of existing resources in the community, the lack of familiarity with the meaning of the psychological changes and coping mechanisms that develop in the process of growing older, as well as the fact that reasonable alternatives to institutionalization for the aged are not available in many areas. The increasing number of older people referred to institutions may also reflect a continuing bias regarding our own motivation and the motivation of others toward care for the elderly, in part because the potential for growth in the later years is not yet appreciated. I have mentioned the fact that many older people who have serious cortical losses are able to maintain themselves with a reasonable degree of integration in their own homes. Alexander Simon, David Blau, and others have demonstrated, moreover, that a substantial number of older people who in the past might have been referred to state mental institutions, where they receive little more than custodial care, by the way, can, with careful diagnostic and treatment intervention, be returned to their homes after a relatively brief period of hospitalization. Other workers report that with the introduction of new and stimulating treatment programs, some patients over 65 who have been hospitalized for extended periods and who appear to be vegetating have shown promise for renewed interaction with the external world. I can cite some personal experiences on this. In the state of Illinois, we have a mental hospital at Manteno, which is a small community about 50 miles south of Chicago. This state mental hospital typically has been one in which older people have been sent because there were lack of alternatives. Many people, in fact, have grown old in some of these state mental hospitals. In the past 2 or 3 years, a new program has been initiated at this hospital, which is designed specifically for older people. And we have tried particularly new treatment ideas with some people who have been there for many years. We were very gratified and encouraged by the fact that some of the people who we assumed just could not be reached any longer have responded very favorably to these treatment techniques. They've responded so favorably, in fact, that some who have been in the hospital for as long as 5 or 6 or 7 years have been returned to the community. Now, I don't mean to paint too rosy a picture here. There are going to be many who can't be reached. The important point is that there are many who can respond to some of these new treatment techniques. We have reached a point where we are beginning to ask more pertinent questions regarding mental illness in old age. And we are also questioning certain assumptions about the state of health of other people. For example, research on mental disorders of old age, as of those of younger age groups, have demonstrated that the mentally ill, both hospitalized and non-hospitalized, are socially more isolated than are their healthier peers. It was felt that this high degree of social isolation was related to the high incidence of mental illness in old age. Marjorie Lowenthal's work at Langley Porter Neuropsychiatric Institute in San Francisco, however, raises some doubt regarding the accuracy of this assumption. First, she states that the hospitalized aged show evidence of greater social withdrawal since age 50, and second, that persons who are lifelong isolates are evidently no more prone to mental illness in old age than anyone else. In a recent paper, Lowenthal concluded that isolation may be a consequence rather than a cause of the mental illness that develops in old age. David Blau and some of his co-workers have questioned whether such factors as degree of physical illness, disinterested families, or lack of economic resources are more important than psychological disturbance in psychiatric hospitalization of the aged. Although his research sample was too small in number to make broad generalizations, the findings suggest that many patients were in difficulty for a long time before hospitalization, but managed to maintain a precarious equilibrium in the community until stress occurred to destroy that balance. Obviously, other questions regarding the reasons for and pathways to mental disorders and institutionalization of the aged still need to be asked. The necessity for raising and answering more meaningful questions and of attempting to provide reasonable alternatives to long-term institutionalization in the aged has led us in Illinois to envision the development of pragmatic treatment programs which are now in the early planning stages. Philosophically, we believe that the warehousing of patients in large institutions, usually at a great distance from the patient's home, is demonstrably wasteful of human resources, frequently prevents social reintegration, and typically results in individual reintegration that is institutional rather than social or family in orientation. We also must make realistic distinctions between actual therapeutic effort that is goal-directed and the institutional caretaker. Our therapeutic efforts must be applied so as to maximize the patient's capacity to reintegrate, making the orientation of our treatment philosophy outward-directed and oriented towards self-sufficiency in the community. This philosophy, by the way, is not completely original, but has its roots in the more progressive mental health programs which have been in existence in Israel and Great Britain for a number of years now. Simply stated, the better programs in these countries recognize the potentially dehumanizing effects of long-term institutionalization and make every effort to maintain individuals in their local communities by bringing a variety of public health services directly into the home. Other people who require hospitalization for emotional disturbance are kept close to their home, where they can participate in community activities and be returned to their routine activities of daily living as soon as possible with as little discontinuity in their life as they can tolerate. I do not mean to leave you with the impression that all older people who come to the attention of mental health workers can be treated successfully and be returned to their homes. There are going to be many who are so emotionally deteriorated or who are suffering from incapacitating physical illness or organic brain disease who do require long-term domiciliary care. Other older people, however, who are undergoing an acute emotional crisis may, with quick intervention and treatment, be returned to their homes. The very crucial issue facing practitioners working with the elderly is to avoid premature and inaccurate diagnostic labeling. Also, sometimes the frustration of working with elderly people, combined with the pressure exerted by his family to do something, anything, may tempt some physicians to overlook or minimize the capacity for improvement in status of their older patients. Such caution with regard to premature labeling is necessary because the symptomatology between an acute depression or paranoid state may be easily confused with some of the symptoms of an acute brain syndrome or chronic brain syndrome. All have in common at times such symptoms as memory loss, confusion, heightened suspiciousness, delusions, hallucinations, or other such states. In the development and implementation of our mental health program for the aged in Chicago, we hope to be able to reinforce the integrative capacity of our patients despite the deficits they have sustained. Consonant with this approach, we plan to develop a number of sub-programs, the aim of which will be to preserve independent living in the community for as long as it is reasonably possible. The first such subgroupings of programs will be aimed at providing ongoing informal seminars and workshops for such resource persons as directors of Golden Age Clubs, clergy, physicians, visiting nurse association members, and other such people. The purpose of the seminars would be to inform these people and offer advice regarding new concepts in the treatment and care of the elderly. We would also plan to offer these people and agencies consultation with regard to setting up and implementing their own programs for the elderly. We would also anticipate providing direct casework consultation in terms of medical and/or psychiatric evaluation of patients. Not only do we want to provide counseling to existing agencies working with the aged, but also to one very neglected and often overlooked resource, that is the family of the disturbed older person. Often it becomes a problem for the family to tolerate the demands and apparent lack of consideration of some of the older members. We would anticipate helping such a family deal with the problem in at least two ways. The first would be to offer direct counseling in an attempt to help them deal with and resolve some of the areas of conflict that exist. The second approach would be to provide a respite from the tensions by having the older person spend part of his day in a daycare program at our facility where he will have an opportunity to participate in a number of stimulating and potentially therapeutic tasks. If this fails, another means of reducing family tension might be for the older person and his family to take a vacation from each other. The older member might stay at our zone center for a week or 10 days while his family vacations at home or elsewhere. We feel that at times to separate various members of the family is very functional in resolving any conflict that might exist. A major feature of our program will consist of staff teams communicating with the elderly in their homes. This mobile team will serve a number of functions. It will offer necessary treatment to elderly who already have the capacity to live alone, and to encourage other elderly persons in need to take advantage of various treatment programs we offer at the center. By being direct representatives of the Zone Center in such informal fashion, a member or members of the team may be able to overcome any fear or hesitancy which would prevent earlier contact with us on the part of the older person. Another feature of this team approach would be to provide either continuing contact with those already functioning adequately in the community or aftercare follow-up for those who we have discharged from the center. I can't stress too much this point. In many cases, we have programs in the United States for treating older people, and some of them are quite good. Often the problem seems to arise from the fact that treatment ends the moment a person leaves the hospital. Often he goes back into the same kind of sociological or family problems which have originally precipitated some of his difficulty, and there we have lost all we have gained. We feel it is extremely important that treatment continue after someone leaves the hospital so that we can help minimize some of the potentially harmful effects of family situations or other situations which give rise to emotional problems in the older people. A third sub-program we contemplate at the Zone Center in Chicago is a short-term acute inpatient service. The aim of such a service would be to provide a therapeutic setting within which acutely disturbed older people would have an opportunity to reintegrate. While on the inpatient unit, patients will be given a complete medical and psychological workup, which will allow us to evaluate his capacity and potential to return to his home. The philosophy of such a treatment program, as with all others, will emphasize the adaptive and healthy aspects of the personality to which I have referred earlier. We will attempt to design the programs and to train staff in the treatment philosophy which will be aimed at the restoration of feelings of self-respect of the patients we will serve. One additional factor in a community mental health effort of this type is that which is suggested by the term community. Treatment should be a community effort. Instead of the traditional movement of patients from agency to agency, where services are often duplicated and uncoordinated, we will attempt to ensure continuity of patient care. Our intention is that when a patient is referred to us, the referring agency will be expected to participate in treatment planning and implementation. To further ensure continuity of care, upon discharge, the patient will be seen in aftercare follow-up by the original referring agency with Zone Center staff personnel providing consultation as necessary. As many of you are well aware, the problems of trying to bring to fruition a program of this type are many. We have to overcome a great deal of skepticism, both professional and lay, regarding the value of any program designed for older people which emphasizes the potential for growth. Moreover, just opening our doors to the community of older people and their families will not automatically ensure that they will take advantage of our services. Many of you who have worked with the elderly have no doubt run up against their apparent apathy or hesitancy to take the first step in utilizing the services you offer. We hope, for example, that through the team approach and through efforts to publicize our services, to make some inroads toward reaching a solution to this problem. In conclusion, the world of the older person is a very difficult one to define because of the very great complexity with which we have to work. It must be understood within the context of historical and technological changes, systematic psychological changes over the lifespan, as well as the individual's own personality dynamics. Throughout, I have tried to focus on the potential for the older person to adapt to the crises of later life and to roll with the punches. In an attempt to maximize the adaptive capacity of the older person, we are now developing treatment programs in Chicago so that patient flow is outbound directed and oriented toward self-sufficiency in the community. In these efforts, it is imperative not to lose sight of the individual and of his own personal needs. Along these lines, a former director of a home for the aged in Chicago tells the story of how an older man, a very gentle soul, sheepishly entered his office with a request to have a room by himself in the home. In a quiet tone of voice, he said, "You know, Mr. Grossman, everything is really very nice in your home. But there is one trouble only. You know, my wife and I were married for 45 years, and that's a long time to live with a woman. I come here, and I find I have to learn to live with a man in the same room. Now, Mr. Grossman, how can you expect that of an old man?" Thank you.